Hello everyone. Thanks for taking such active part in our two epistemology seminars this past week. The first one on the tripartite theory of knowledge, and the second one, or the second part of the seminar, on self-knowledge. Now, many of you raised some extremely interesting questions. You put forward some very thoughtful, very thought-provoking points and ideas, and we really managed to get to the heart of a lot of difficult issues on both of these two topics. But of course, a week is quite short, so we didn't manage to cover everything. What I propose to do now, therefore, is go over some of the points we covered in the seminars and also add a few things that you might find useful as you start to think about your essays. In our first seminar, we discussed the tripartite theory of knowledge. We began by considering what question this theory is supposed to answer. Indeed, what philosophical problem it's supposed to solve. We then looked at why answering this question or addressing this problem might matter, at the very least to us as philosophers, but perhaps even more widely. We saw that the central question that the tripartite theory tries to answer is, of course, the question of what knowledge is, but more specifically the question of what propositional knowledge is, and in particular, what the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions might be for a person to count as knowing that a certain fact obtains or that a certain proposition is true. I distinguished briefly propositional knowledge, or so-called knowledge that, from other types of knowledge, such as from knowledge how or knowledge by acquaintance. A classic example of knowing how might be knowing how to ride a bicycle, whereas an instance of acquaintance knowledge might be knowing a particular person. The important point is that the tripartite theory only aims to provide an account of propositional knowledge, that is, of cases where we say that someone knows that, say, it's raining, or they know that the Earth moves around the sun. So the fact that the tripartite theory cannot or might not be able to make sense of what it is to have an ability, or what it is to know a person, or to be familiar with a place, is not going to count against this theory, since these are not things that the tripartite theory is trying to provide an analysis of. Right? Some people argue that, for instance, ability knowledge is at bottom a form of propositional knowledge, but these aren't controversies that we need to get into in order to evaluate the tripartite theory. We can just take it as a theory of propositional knowledge and see how well it does at accounting for that. Having established what the question is, we then asked ourselves, why determining what propositional knowledge is matters? Is this just a pedantic technical point of definition, or is there something more problematic and important about getting to the bottom of what knowledge is? Well, first of all, we saw that we base many of our most important decisions and views, but also some of our more mundane ones, on what we consider ourselves to know. We also trust what others say based on what we think they know, and certainly based on the assumption that they do have knowledge. Right, so our attributions of knowledge say something about what we think we can rely on, and it's a matter of no small importance to us whether we do have knowledge, what we can be considered to know, and indeed what actually constitutes genuinely knowing something. Secondly, we saw that questions about what does and does not constitute knowledge arise against a background of skeptical worries and against a background of concerns about the apparent impossibility of ever having full certainty about anything. Right? When it comes to most propositions about the way the world is in particular, certainty just doesn't seem to be there to be had, but it also seems too much to ask. We feel that we can and do know things, despite the fact that we're not guaranteed to always get things right. But if certainty is not necessary for knowledge, what is necessary for knowledge? In fact, what is enough for knowledge? And how are we to even go about finding out? The question of what knowledge is does not appear to be primarily an empirical question. After all, no amount of investigation into how the world is, into what beliefs people have, or into the bases on which they hold them, can tell us whether they count as knowing something, let alone what knowledge itself is, unless we have already come to a view of what the criteria are for counting as knowing something. And no amount of further investigation into facts about the world or anyone's beliefs or their reasons for holding them will tell us that. So the question of what constitutes knowledge appears to be, first and foremost, a question about what we mean when we say that someone knows something. But it's not just a question about our concept of knowledge, but of course also a metaphysical question about what knowledge itself is. Though it's about a property that we attribute or that we say that someone has when we say that they know something. In other words, it's a question about what must be the case, about what criteria need to actually be met if a person is to count as knowing something in the sense of the term knowing that we are actually interested in and care about. So one of the questions that came up in the forum is that of why we can't just come up with a neat and precise definition of what knowledge is and go with that. In that way, we could just avoid the messiness and vagueness of our ordinary concept of knowledge. Now, on the face of it, this would seem to provide an appealing way out of the problem of pinning down what knowledge is. The problem that came out, of course, is that if we simply redefine, for practical purposes, the word knowledge, this will not actually tell us what knowledge is in the sense that matters to us. Right? When someone knows something, when we say that someone knows something, we're saying that their view can be relied upon in a certain way. We're not just attributing to them an arbitrary property, but a property that we might base some of our own decisions and beliefs on. Right, so we can't just redefine what we're talking about when we use the word knowledge without losing sight of the very property that we wanted to more fully understand and pin down. So there's no way around the need to focus on what we actually ordinarily mean when we say that a person S knows that P. And to the extent that we're engaged in a process of conceptual analysis, a process of uncovering what we mean by knowledge, one way in which we'll be able to address this question is by testing our intuitions about whether a person S knows or doesn't know that P against particular cases, against real or hypothetical cases where certain conditions are or are not met. This will allow us to determine whether certain conditions are or are not necessary or are not sufficient for knowledge. Now, the paper by Gettier, Is Justified True Belief Knowledge, does precisely that. Right? He sets out a couple of thought experiments aimed at showing that intuitively, the tripartite theory of what knowledge is doesn't get things quite right. So what exactly is the tripartite theory of knowledge? This was something you all spelt out very clearly. According to this theory, a person S counts as knowing that P if and only if the following three conditions are met. First, the proposition P is true. Next, S believes that P. And thirdly, S is justified in believing that P. Now, many of you put forward examples which seem to show that we wouldn't in fact want to count someone as truly knowing that P if either P was false, or if S did not actually believe that P, or if they did believe that P but had no good grounds for doing so. In other words, most of you seem to agree with the tripartite theory, at least in its claim, that each of these conditions is necessary for knowledge. But are they necessary? Take the second condition, for instance. Suppose you're asked for someone's phone number, and you're convinced that you don't know it. Right? The person really needs that number, so they beg you to try to remember it and at least to give it your best guess. Now, although insisting you don't know it, you say the first phone number that comes to your head. You're convinced that this is not the right one. In other words, you don't believe that this is the right number, yet let's suppose it turns out to be correct. Let's assume, moreover, that this wasn't pure luck. You had dialed that number many times before, and somehow it must have stayed at the back of your mind. We would we not, want to say that you know this person's number, that you know, say that their number is 12345 or whatever it may be, although you clearly do not believe that this is their number. Now, many similar cases exist relating, for instance, to our knowledge of capital cities or to various facts we may have learned at school but we don't think we remember, and so on. Now, some philosophers have argued that in light of such cases, the second condition, although present in many cases of knowledge, does not in all cases need to be satisfied in order for someone to count as knowing something. You might want to think about how to counter this suggestion, or you might want to think about whether one of the other conditions, for instance, the third, is necessary for knowledge. I'll leave you to think about these things for yourselves, and let's move on to the point that most of you did mention, which is the issue of whether these three conditions are jointly sufficient for knowledge. Those of you who have read Gettier's paper will be aware that the sufficiency claim of the tripartite theory is the one that Gettier's counterexamples put into doubt. And we touched on a number of such examples where all three conditions are met with respect to a person and a particular proposition, yet where we wouldn't want to say that the person in question knows that the proposition is true. So just to remind you of one of Getche's own examples, he describes a case where a person, Smith, is told by his boss that his colleague Jones will be given a promotion. Now Smith, for unrelated reasons and perhaps inexplicable reasons, happens to have counted the coins in Jones's pocket. Now, as a result of this, Smith comes to believe that the person who will get promoted has 10 coins in his pocket. Unknown to Smith, however, it turns out that Smith himself will get the promotion and also happens to have 10 coins in his pocket. Right, so here Smith has a true belief that the person who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket. He's justified in holding this belief, yet it turns out to be a matter of mere accident that Smith's belief is true. Intuitively, we would not want to say that Smith knows that the person who will get the promotion has 10 coins in his pocket, because he believes this on the basis of information relating to Jones, rather than on the basis of information relating to himself, the actual person who will get the promotion. Now, what this example and similar ones are supposed to illustrate is that having a true belief that is justified is, contrary to what the tripartite theory tells us, not sufficient for knowledge. This has led to what is known as the Getche problem, named after his paper setting out these types of apparent counterexamples to the tripartite theory. Right, so the Getche problem is the problem of how to account for what knowledge is in light of the existence of cases that seem to suggest that one can have a justified true belief where it's nevertheless a matter of pure luck that a person's belief is true, and that we therefore wouldn't want to count as knowledge. Of course, when we say that someone has knowledge, we seem to mean something stronger than that they have a true belief, the one which, however good their reasons might be for holding it, could be true as a matter of pure luck. There have been a number of attempts to respond to this problem of explaining what knowledge is in the face of the apparent insufficiency of justified true belief, and we discussed some of these responses in the forum. In particular, we touched on the option of either adding a further fourth condition to the three conditions of the tripartite theory, or instead of strengthening the third condition, the justification condition, in such a way that would rule out a person from counting as justified in believing a proposition in cases where it was a matter of pure coincidence that their belief was true. So here are some of the standard approaches to the Getche problem. It's worth noting that these are approaches that accept the premise that knowledge can be provided with a reductive analysis, right? So it's just a matter of getting this analysis right. One possible approach is to add a fourth condition, such as, for example, the so-called no false lemmas or no false premises condition. In Getche's own example that I just ran through, Smith's belief is clearly based on a false premise, namely that Jones will be the one who gets the promotion. Right? So this is an option you might want to think about and evaluate in your essays. You could see if you can come up with an example which we would not want to count as knowledge, yet where the person in question has a justified true belief, which they have arrived at based on only true premises. Right? This would show that adding this fourth condition doesn't solve the Getche problem, and that we would still be left with a set of conditions that are jointly insufficient for knowledge. A second approach you might want to explore is that of denying that the people in standard Getche-style counterexamples are actually justified in their belief. You might argue that if we strengthen in appropriate ways the justification condition, we might still be able to say that justified true belief is knowledge, but that justification ought to be viewed as a more demanding condition than what it's generally assumed to be. Now, one of the issues that came up in the forum is that of whether it really matters whether we call what we're doing adding a fourth condition or strengthening the third. In a sense, of course, it doesn't matter if all we want to do is set out the conditions for knowledge without really worrying about what these conditions are called. However, insofar as the concept of justification is an important one in its own right, we might want to get what justification is right and not impose conditions on it, which would rule out cases from being instances of justification, which we would intuitively want to say are clear instances where a person is justified in holding a particular belief, where they have been cognitively responsible in arriving at this belief. So if you want to opt for strengthening the condition of justification in answer to the Getche problem, this has to be because you think that what we mean by justification is not satisfied in many Gettier-style counterexamples. A third way you might go is to replace the justification condition with a different condition. Perhaps with a condition such as that true belief has to be formed through a reliable method, whether perception or reason or whatever it may be. Now, of course, on some views, to be formed through a reliable method just is what it is to be justified. So again, you might want to consider whether replacing the justification condition really amounts to replacing it, or instead to just accurately capturing what it is for someone to be justified. In any case, these are some of the approaches you might want to explore and think about when writing your essays. For a relevant reading on each of these, have a look at the course study guide. You can also have a look at an article entitled The Analysis of Knowledge in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where many of these and other responses to the Gettier problem are covered, and which contain a list of references and relevant readings associated with each one. One final possibility we touched on in the forum is the possibility that the project of analyzing knowledge might actually be doomed to fail. And one of you mentioned Zygzebski's view that knowledge cannot actually be broken down into separate elements or into more fundamental conditions. As it happens on this view, as long as we allow for a gap to exist between belief and truth, or between justification or any alternative or additional condition and truth, there will always be counterexamples we can come up with where a person has a true belief that meets the justification or other conditions, yet where it's a matter of mere accident that they got things right. So on Zygzebski's view, the concept of knowledge is in fact primitive, in the sense that although it can be appealed to perhaps to explain other notions, it cannot itself be analyzed any further. We have a sense of what knowledge is and of when it's present and when it's not. But what it is that we're saying when we say that S knows that P cannot be articulated beyond repeating that what we're saying is that S knows that P. Right? So this is another option you might want to think about and evaluate in your essays on the Gettier problem and on the tripartite theory. This is about as far as we got, but it should be enough to allow you to take on the set question. Right? So here's the question to consider. If knowledge is not justified true belief, is it justified true belief that meets also some further condition? Good luck with that, and I'll move on now to our second seminar on self-knowledge. Hello again. As with our first seminar, we began our second seminar, or the second part of our seminar, by asking ourselves, what is at issue? What is the philosophical question we're trying to answer? What is the philosophical problem we're trying to solve? Right, so in this case, we began with the question, what is self-knowledge? What is meant by self-knowledge in this context? And what is particularly problematic about self-knowledge? In answer to the first question, as you all pointed out, what is meant by self-knowledge in this context is knowledge specifically of our own mental states, rather than, say, knowledge of the self or of what kind of being we are. Right, what we were interested in the second seminar was the question of how we know our own beliefs, thoughts, experiences, and so on. More specifically, how we know our own conscious such mental states. Right, so the key question is, how do we know the contents of our own conscious minds? The problem is that this knowledge appears to be unlike our knowledge of anything else. That is, unlike our knowledge of the minds of others, unlike our knowledge of the external world, and even unlike our knowledge of our own unconscious states. We noted in the forum that self-knowledge seems to exhibit in particular three very distinctive characteristics that are not shared by our knowledge of other things. Some of you had a go at identifying these features, which led us to a discussion of how it's actually quite difficult to identify these features in a way that doesn't already presuppose a particular theoretical approach to them. That is, in a way that doesn't already presuppose a particular way of explaining them. So trying to start with as theory-neutral way of characterizing these features as possible, we can perhaps say that our knowledge of our own conscious minds is distinctive in being, first of all, immediate, secondly, first-person authoritative, and thirdly, what I called in the seminar, immune to non-cognitive error. let's briefly remind ourselves of what each of these amounts to. Our knowledge of our own minds is first of all immediate, at least in that in order to know what we're thinking or what we believe, we don't seem to need to go through any lengthy process of deliberation. In most cases, it's enough to just ask ourselves a question of whether we're thinking about something or of whether we hold a particular belief. We may, of course, sometimes need to engage in some investigation in order to arrive at a belief in the first place. So, for instance, I may need to look out the window in order to arrive at a view of whether it is or is not raining. But once I have come to a view on that matter, I don't seem to need to go through any additional process of reasoning or investigation in order to be able to say whether I do or do not believe that it's raining. Our knowledge of our own minds is then first-person authoritative in that we seem to be far better placed than anyone else is to say what's currently going through our mind. So, for example, if I'm now thinking to myself that I would like a cup of coffee, I'm clearly better placed to say that this thought is occurring to me than anyone else is, no matter how much they might have been paying attention to my behavior. In fact, assuming I didn't just say this out loud, namely that I would like a cup of coffee, I would seem to be the only person able to know that this thought was occurring to me. And this becomes increasingly obvious the more sophisticated the thought in question is. For example, if I'm having the thought that knowledge is not justified true belief, but I'm not voicing this view out loud, it would be virtually impossible for anyone else to work out that I was having this thought, yet it would remain entirely obvious to me. Finally, our knowledge of our own conscious states seems to exhibit what I called in the forum immunity to non-cognitive error. Although our knowledge of our own mental states, even of our conscious mental states, is not entirely infallible, it does not seem to be prone to certain specific types of error, namely to what are sometimes called brute errors, or what I'm calling non-cognitive errors, that is, to errors which are neither due to any cognitive deficit, such as irrationality or division of the mind, nor due to conceptual incompetence, or indeed to lying. So, for example, if I consciously believe that it's raining, that is, if I would consciously judge that it's raining, and I consider the matter of whether I hold this belief, I cannot, it seems, first of all, fail to know that I would assent to this proposition, namely to the proposition that it's raining, nor can I mistake this belief that it's raining for, say, the belief or the judgment that the keys are on the table. In fact, if I was to assert, it is raining, but I do not believe that it is, or if I was to believe that I was thinking about my keys when in fact I'm thinking about the weather, there would seem to be reason to be concerned either about my rationality or my understanding of the terms that I'm using, or indeed my sincerity. So in other words, although we can certainly make judgments that are mistaken about our conscious mental states, we would tend to assume that such mistaken judgments must be associated with some kind of cognitive breakdown. And this is illustrated particularly vividly by our reactions to what's called Moore's paradox, that is, to statements of the form, I believe that P but not P, or P is true but I do not believe that P. Note that there would be nothing odd about saying something like, it is raining but Mary does not believe that it is, or anything odd about Susan thinking about her keys, or me believing that Susan's thinking about her keys when in fact she's thinking about the weather. Right, so our knowledge of the minds of others does seem to be potentially subject to non-cognitive errors, as does our knowledge of the external world through sense perception. So in the case of sense perception, it seems that we can easily make mistakes, that is, misperceive something due, for instance, to bad lighting conditions, and as a result of that, misjudge what's directly in front of us without being in any way irrational. In perception, that is, unlike in self-knowledge, non-cognitive error is clearly possible. One can make mistakes, despite being fully rational and conceptually competent. This is distinctively not the case in self-knowledge. If I'm perfectly rational and I fully understand the meanings of the terms that I'm using, it simply does not seem possible that I could fail to know what's currently going through my conscious mind. Right, so after going over the various distinctive characteristics of our knowledge of our own mental states, the next question we considered was, how is this kind of knowledge possible? What kind of knowledge is it? What does it amount to? So what I'd like to do now is just give you a quick overview of the four approaches I've listed here. so as to make sure that you've understood them. And I'll mention briefly how each purports to accommodate the features just listed a little while ago, and also I'll touch on just one possible problem one might raise for each one. It'll be up to you in your essays to explore further possible arguments, either in favor or against each of these accounts. Actually, the essay questions I set focus specifically on the perceptual model and on one type of constitutive account. So you might want to pay more attention to these, but I'll run through all four of these anyway, just to give you a frame of reference. Right, so let's start with the inferential model that we discussed briefly in the forum and that some of you noted is not actually particularly plausible. According to the inferential model of self-knowledge, and a key proponent of this model is Gilbert Ryle, for instance, we know our own conscious thoughts, beliefs, desires, and so on, essentially by inference from observing our own behavior in the same way as we know the mental states of others, except that we're able to do so much faster and more accurately in our own case, since we have observed ourselves for far longer than anyone else has. We're therefore more able to quickly and accurately detect patterns in our behavior, which are suggestive of this or that mental state. So on this view, our knowledge is not different in kind to our knowledge of the mental states of others, but only different in degree. We know our own minds better, but not in any fundamentally different way to the way in which we know the minds of others. Now, as one of you pointed out in the forum, this theory of self-knowledge doesn't seem to be able to capture very well the immediacy, let alone the apparently non-inferential character of our knowledge of our own minds. Now, of course, the idea that this knowledge is non-inferential is a feature that this model denies. Nonetheless, it's difficult to defend since we're clearly able to ascribe thoughts and beliefs to ourselves with little effort, even when no behavioral evidence or very little behavioral evidence is available to us for interpretation. So I seem to be able to know that I'm having this or that complex thought, say about astronomy, even though I may be completely silent and sitting perfectly still, and certainly not exhibiting any fine-grained enough behavior to allow me to say that this is what I'm thinking about. At best, I would have to watch what I was doing for very subtle clues and perhaps observe the whole context of my behavior in order to be in any position at all to hazard a guess as to what I was thinking about at that time, let alone work out that I was thinking about astronomy. So I'll leave you to think for yourselves about whether the inferential model does any better at explaining the other two features, first-person authority, and in particular, immunity to non-cognitive error. On the perceptual approach to self-knowledge, the idea is that we have an inner sense mechanism in our brain by which we can directly perceive our own conscious states in an analogous way to the way in which, through our external senses, we can directly perceive outside objects. Now, in some views, this inner sense produces intermediate experiences of our mental states, on the basis of which we're then able to judge that we have this or that state. But as many of you noted in the forum, there do not seem to be any intermediate experiential states in the case of self-knowledge that might be analogous to, say, visual experiences in the case of visual perception. That said, most perceptual theories of self-knowledge, not least Armstrong's, do not posit any such intermediate states. What these accounts do posit is a purely causal, reliable mechanism, much as our five senses are reliable causal mechanisms, which results in our forming beliefs about our own mental states, which happen to be more accurate than any beliefs we might arrive at through observing our own behavior. Now, on the face of it, the immunity to non-cognitive error of self-knowledge that we noted earlier cannot be so easily accommodated by this view. Right? Brute causal errors, that is, errors that are not due to any cognitive or conceptual failure on our part, of the kind that are possible in ordinary perception, do not seem to be possible in introspection. And insofar as we take it to be of the very nature of perception and perceptual knowledge, that it is subject to such error because the link between object and perceptual belief is purely causal, then the immunity to such error, which is characteristic of our knowledge of our own minds, cannot be properly explained within a perceptual framework. Now, of course, one might insist that inner sense or our inner perceptual mechanism is less prone to error because there's no equivalent of, say, interfering lighting conditions in the case of inner sense perception. There's no intermediate experience which might be inaccurate between our mental states and our judgments about them, and that this is what explains why self-knowledge is not prone to brute causal errors. But to point out the various important ways in which self-knowledge is different from external sense perception is in fact to move further and further away from a model of self-knowledge which is in any intelligible way perceptual. Right? So we've already got rid of the idea that there are intermediate experiences between our mental states and our beliefs about them. And we've now also ruled out the possibility of brute causal breakdowns. Yet, in order for an appeal to the idea of an inner sense or inner perceptual mechanism to illuminate what self-knowledge amounts to, we cannot say that the various ways in which self-knowledge is distinctive and which need explaining are precisely ways in which self-knowledge is unlike external sense perception. Right? In particular, an appeal to perception cannot explain why all inaccuracies in the ascription of our conscious states appear to be linked to some kind of irrationality. Right? An appeal to a perceptual mechanism, that is to some kind of reliable, purely causal mechanism linking our conscious mental states to our self-ascriptive judgments, cannot explain why we find it odd to hear someone say something like, I believe that it's raining, but it's not raining. Right? In ordinary perception, it's perfectly possible that there might be a tree in front of me, and for me not to believe that there is one without my necessarily seeming to be in the grip of some kind of contradiction, right, or irrationality when I say that there's no tree there. Right, so the parallels and differences between self-knowledge and external sense perception are ones you might want to explore further in your essays. There are many forms of so-called constitutive accounts as came up in the forum. I'm just going to mention two of them here. The expressivist view, as endorsed by Jane Heal, for instance, and is sometimes attributed, though perhaps not entirely appropriately, to Wittgenstein. And second, Crispin Wright's account, according to which having a belief is simply constitutive of making an avowal. That is, it's constitutive of saying that one has it. According to both of these accounts, the sense we have that our knowledge of our own minds is somehow special is just an artifact of a kind of grammatical misconstrual. On the expressivist view, the appearance that we have some special way of knowing our own minds is a result of a misconstrual of expressions of belief as genuine assertions about them. So on this view, saying things like, I believe that it is raining, or I am in pain, are just alternative ways of saying it is raining, or ouch. So it's no surprise that these judgments are immediate, first-person authoritative, and immune to non-cognitive error. Second-order judgments are, in fact, on this view, not genuinely second-order. They're just spontaneous manifestations of first-order beliefs. So when I say I believe that it's raining, all I'm really saying is that it's raining. On the second approach, Crispin Wright's view, our sense that we're able to access our own mental states in some special way is just the artifact of a misunderstanding of a certain linguistic practice of ours, a practice that we take to reflect something deeper that goes beyond it. More specifically, the idea is that it's just part of our practices with the words believe, desire, and so on, that any person's immediate claims about her own mental states are taken as correct and authoritative. What someone believes, desires, and so on is in part to be identified by what this person claims to believe, desire, and so on. This is why it appears that the person making these avowals stands in some kind of special position to know what her mental states are. What mental states someone has, though, are simply to be assumed to be the mental states that they say that they have, unless there's some extraordinary reason to doubt that. Of course, what this doesn't tell us is how the person herself arrived at these second-order judgments, right? And that's perhaps what we really wanted to know. Moreover, neither the expressivist view nor the view according to which we simply take people's avowals at face value seem to be able to account very well for the fallibility of self-knowledge. Although our judgments about our own minds seem to be immune to certain types of error, as we saw, they're not immune to error altogether. Neither of these views is very well equipped to make room for that. If it's by virtue of you saying, say that you believe that P, that you count as actually believing that P, then there can be no gap between what you believe and what you think you believe. Perhaps most damagingly, though, particularly for the expressivist account according to which to say, I believe that P is just an alternative way of saying P, we're left without any explanation of our apparent ability to know our own mental states in ways that also exhibit the three special features of self-knowledge that we identified earlier, when we're not expressing these first-order states. In other words, how could the expressivist view explain how I know what I'm now thinking, although I'm not actually expressing this thought out loud? So what's left? Well, if we don't know our own thoughts on the basis of inferring them from observing our own behavior, nor on the basis of somehow directly perceiving our own thoughts, and if various forms of constitutive accounts are not particularly plausible, then perhaps we know our own mental states directly on the basis of thinking them. This is a view that cropped up briefly in our discussions on the forum. In other words, the idea here is that our second-order judgments of the form, I believe that P, or I'm having an experience of mountains, as in this picture, these second-order judgments are based on reasons, not, however, either on inferential reasons or on interperceptual grounds, but directly on the mental states self-ascribed themselves. Now, I won't go into this account in any detail, but there's one clear question it raises, namely that of how there can be a direct reason-giving relation between a first-order belief and a second-order judgment about it, given that having a belief about the world, and that's what a first-order belief is, how can that possibly directly justify us in making a judgment about our mental states, that is, about what we believe, since nothing about what we believe follows directly from how things are in the world? Well, I'll leave you with that thought and move now on to the essay questions. For your essays which are due next week, and I do hope you find the time to write these essays, you can choose in relation to our second seminar to answer either of these two questions. The first is, do we know our own thoughts through a form of interperception? All right, this question is obviously asking you to set out and evaluate the perceptual model of self-knowledge. The second question is saying, I believe that P, just an alternative way of saying P, is in turn asking you to assess the expressivist position. Right, if you want to read more on self-knowledge or on this or that specific approach to it, there is an excellent anthology of papers called Knowing Our Own Mind, edited by Crispin Wright, Barry Smith, and Cynthia MacDonald. You can also find references to various authors on different theories of self-knowledge, of course, in the article by Gertler, which was the set reading for this seminar. And if you want further reading suggestions, of course, simply drop me a line and I'll be happy to provide you with more detailed references. For now, though, I look forward to reading your essays.